Before you scroll, stop for a second and feel this. What if the silence was never empty? What if the distance was never the end? What if the person who walked away into someone else's arms never truly escaped what they felt for you? Because sometimes a person can leave your side, change their routine, change their company, even change the story they tell the world, and still carry one unfinished truth deep inside. A truth that follows them into quiet nights, into crowded rooms, into moments when there is nowhere left to run. And that truth is simple. They did not lose the feeling. They only delayed facing it. Stay with me because what comes next may explain more than the silence ever did. This is not about fantasy. It is not about chasing false hope. It is about what happens when someone chooses what feels easier instead of what feels real, and later finds out that ease cannot silence the heart forever. If you have ever felt that a bond never fully broke, that something stayed open even after the ending, then you already understand the weight of this message, and by the end of this, you may see clearly why their heart never fully left, why their mind kept circling back, and why the truth they buried has now become too loud for them to ignore any longer. They were with someone else, yes, but not because you lacked value, not because you were easy to replace, not because someone else was more special, more worthy, or more important than you. They moved in another direction because something inside them was afraid of what was real. What they felt with you was not light. It was not shallow. It did not fit neatly into the kind of connection a person can control with half effort and safe distance. It asked more from them. It asked for honesty. It asked for depth. It asked for emotional presence. And at that time, they were not ready to give that. So they reached for what felt simpler, familiar, less demanding, less exposing. They chose a path where they could keep parts of themselves hidden and still function. On the outside, it may have looked like certainty. On the inside, it was often fear dressed up as peace. And that matters because many people confuse calm with truth. They think if something is easier, it must be right. If something asks less from them, it must be safer. If something does not shake them deeply, it must be better. But real connection does not always arrive quietly. Sometimes it reaches into the parts of a person they have spent years avoiding. Sometimes it asks them to grow before they feel ready. And instead of stepping into that growth, they step back. If this already feels familiar, keep listening, because the next truth goes even deeper. What they found elsewhere may have looked stable on the surface, but stable does not always mean meaningful. Predictable does not always mean fulfilling. They could keep going there without being challenged too much. They could speak without saying everything. They could show up without truly being seen. They could remain in control. And for a while, that kind of arrangement can feel manageable. It can even feel like relief. But over time, routine has a way of exposing emptiness. The days begin to repeat. The conversations start to sound the same. The heart stays quiet, but not peaceful, just muted. And in that muted space, the memory of something more alive begins to rise. Not always in dramatic ways, not through a sudden movie-like moment. More often, it returns in the stillness, in the pause after a long day, in the late-night thought they did not invite, in the small comparison they did not mean to make, in the strange ache that appears when life looks fine on paper but feels thin in the soul. That is where your presence remained. Not always as a face in front of them, but as a truth behind everything else. A reminder of what it felt like to be emotionally moved in a way they could not easily explain. A reminder of what they left unfinished. A reminder that some bonds do not disappear just because someone tried to walk away from them. Comment still here if you know what it means to feel something unfinished long after the story looked over. And this is where the real shift began. Not when they missed attention, not when they felt lonely for a night, not when life became inconvenient. The real shift began when they could no longer pretend to themselves. Little by little, they started to notice that something important had been left behind. They saw how much of their true self they had been holding back just to keep life simple. They realized they had been choosing what was manageable over what was meaningful. They had avoided the harder questions. They had turned away from deeper feelings. They had kept themselves in spaces where they did not need to risk full honesty. But avoidance has a cost. It creates distance inside a person. They can smile, talk, work, move, and still feel strangely absent from their own life. Present, but not fully alive. That distance kept growing until it became impossible to ignore. And when that awareness finally settled in, it did not leave quickly. It stayed. It followed them through quiet evenings and empty pauses. It stood behind their routines like a shadow they could not shake. They began to understand that what they had tried to leave behind had not actually been erased. It had only been buried under distraction, fear, and time. And buried truth does something powerful. It waits, patiently, silently, until a person is finally tired enough, quiet enough, or honest enough to face it. If this part is hitting hard, stay to the end, because the reason they could not fully disconnect from you explains everything that happened after. The truth is, they never gave this connection a fair chance before, not because it was weak, not because it was missing value, but because it required courage they did not have at the time. Real openness is hard for people who are used to guarding themselves. Real closeness can feel dangerous to someone who has spent years surviving through distance, control, or emotional caution. To love, honestly, means risk. Risk of rejection, risk of change, risk of being seen without protection, risk of becoming someone new because of what another person awakens in you. And that kind of risk can terrify someone who is not yet ready to face their own inner world. So instead of walking toward the connection, they stepped away from it. Instead of meeting truth, they hid inside comfort. Instead of choosing growth, they chose what helped them avoid themselves. But here is what changed. They now understand that what they were avoiding was never truly you. It was the mirror you held up. It was the depth they felt around you. It was the version of themselves they would have had to become in order to love with honesty, steadiness, and full presence. And once a person sees that clearly, they cannot go back to the old illusion. They cannot keep saying it meant nothing. They cannot keep pretending the distance was proof that the bond was not real. Deep down, they know better now. And that knowledge is heavy, quiet but heavy, steady but impossible to silence. So if they carry an urgent message now, it does not come from performance. It does not come from wanting to impress you with polished words. It does not come from some perfect speech they rehearsed in their mind. It comes from a slower and more uncomfortable place. It comes from realizing that their choices had consequences. It comes from seeing the effect of their silence, their hesitation, and their inconsistency on someone who deserved better. It comes from understanding that they asked you, directly or indirectly, to hold emotional weight that was never yours to carry. And once that truth lands, respect and regret begin to grow side by side. They respect your honesty now more than ever. They respect that you were willing to be emotionally open. They respect that you asked for truth instead of games, presence instead of confusion, effort instead of half-love. And at the same time, they regret not being able to meet you there, not because they did not feel something, but because they lacked the strength to stand inside that feeling with maturity. That regret is not always loud. It often shows up in silence, in memories, in moments when the mind replays what was said, what was not said, what could have been handled differently. It does not scream. It stays. It becomes a quiet pressure in the chest, a quiet honesty in the heart, a quiet knowing that what was avoided still matters. Type yes in your heart if you have ever known that silence can carry more truth than words. What matters most for you to understand is this: none of this was ever proof that you were not enough. Their choices were not a measurement of your beauty, your depth, your worth, or your place in this world. Their choices reflected their emotional readiness, their fear, their limits at that point in life. You were not passed over because someone else was greater. You crossed paths with a person who did not yet have the inner capacity to hold what you offered with both hands, and now they are living inside the result of that. Not necessarily through public drama, not necessarily through some instant return, but through awareness, through the slow and undeniable realization that genuine connection cannot be replaced by convenience, that emotional truth does not vanish just because it was postponed, that a person can try to move on physically while still carrying unfinished emotion, mentally and spiritually. They see now what they delayed. They see what they ignored. They see that someone who gave them sincerity was met with hesitation when sincerity should have been returned. And that clarity changes people. It makes excuses feel thin. It makes old stories fall apart. It makes them face the reality that what they called timing, confusion, or circumstance was often fear hiding behind softer names. Remember this part. Come back to it if you ever doubt yourself. Their inability to choose rightly back then was never a final statement about your value. It was a statement about the battle they were still losing inside themselves. And once fear is seen clearly, it loses some of its power, but it leaves behind truth that cannot be ignored. They have had to sit with what they avoided, the closeness they ran from, the honesty they delayed, the vulnerability they treated like danger. They have had to admit that while they may have shown up somewhere else in body, a part of them never fully left you in heart. That does not mean they handled it well. It does not erase what happened. It does not cancel your pain. But it does explain the strange pull that never seemed to fully die. Because when a connection reaches a deep place inside a person, it does not disappear on command. It stays in the background of their emotional life. It appears in comparisons they never mean to make, in people who seem fine but feel flat, in experiences that should satisfy them but somehow do not, in moments where they realize they have been living around the truth instead of in it. This is why their external life and internal world may not have matched for a long time. What others saw was one story. What they carried inside was another. And as that contrast became stronger, so did the need to finally stop hiding from it. If you are still with me, listen closely, because this next part is where your power returns to you. This message is not about asking you to wait. It is not about telling you to pause your life while someone else catches up to their own heart. It is not about romanticizing confusion, rewarding inconsistency, or excusing emotional immaturity. It is about clarity, yours, because while they were learning through regret, you were also changing. You were learning the cost of accepting unclear energy. You were learning how much peace matters. You were learning that mixed signals can wound more deeply than honest endings. You were learning that self-respect sometimes sounds like silence, distance, and walking away from what cannot meet you in truth, and that growth matters just as much as theirs. In fact, it changes the entire story, because if they now see clearly what you meant, they are not meeting the same version of you they once knew. They would be meeting someone stronger, someone more grounded, someone less willing to shrink, chase, guess, or settle. Someone who now understands that emotional openness is not weakness, and that asking for honesty was never too much. It was simply right. This is why any future step, if one ever happens, cannot be based on old confusion. It would have to be based on conscious choice, real accountability, and mutual emotional maturity. Otherwise, it is just the old pattern trying to wear a new face, and you have outgrown that. There is also a deeper reason they could not fully leave you emotionally, even while trying to build something elsewhere. You represented more than affection. You represented truth. You represented the kind of bond that asks a person to become real, not charming, not strategic, not half-present, real. And people do not always run from people. Sometimes they run from what a person awakens in them. Around you, they may have felt seen in ways that made hiding harder. They may have sensed that the connection was asking for a level of inner honesty they had not yet developed, so part of them reached for distraction, for structure, for anything that helped them avoid facing that call. But the deeper self always remembers. It remembers what felt alive. It remembers what reached the soul instead of just filling time. That is why even after trying to move forward, they could not fully detach. Something in them kept returning to the emotional imprint you left, not because of obsession. Not because of simple nostalgia, but because the bond marked them. It revealed a standard. It showed them what depth felt like. And once a person has touched something real, everything less than real starts to feel thinner with time. Share this message with your own spirit if you have ever needed the reminder that being unforgettable is not about being louder. Sometimes it is simply about being genuine in a world full of emotional masks. Regret then becomes part of their growth. Not a punishment, but a teacher. It teaches them what avoidance costs. It shows them that delay is not neutral when another heart is involved. It reveals that every moment of indecision, every quiet withdrawal, every unfinished sentence had impact. And impact does not vanish just because time passes. The longer they sit with this, the more they understand that they once stood in front of something meaningful and did not have the courage to hold it properly. That realization can humble a person in ways nothing else can. It strips away self-protection. It removes the comfort of old excuses. It asks them to look at themselves honestly, not as the version they wanted to believe they were, but as the version their choices revealed. And strange as it sounds, that can become the beginning of real maturity, because until someone sees their own patterns clearly, they keep repeating them. But once they do see them, repetition becomes harder. Pretending becomes harder. Numbing becomes harder. The truth keeps tapping at the door. And while this process changes them, it also changes the meaning of any message they may carry now. It is no longer just emotion. It is responsibility. It is the acknowledgement that what they once mishandled was not small. It mattered. You mattered. The connection mattered. And whether they speak it out loud or carry it silently, they know that now in a way they did not before. At the same time, you have been changing too, and that may be the part no one talks about enough. While they were facing the truth of what they avoided, you were learning how to return to yourself. You were learning to trust your instincts again. You were learning to stop negotiating with what felt wrong in your spirit. You were learning that peace does not come from being chosen by someone confused. Peace comes from choosing yourself clearly. It comes from refusing to build your future on delayed honesty and uncertain effort. It comes from knowing that a real bond should not require you to abandon your dignity just to keep it alive. So if they now feel the weight of your absence, it is because your energy is no longer sitting in the same place waiting for clarity to arrive from the outside. You are becoming your own clarity, and that changes everything. It means that if they ever speak, the moment will not belong only to their realization. It will also belong to your discernment, your standards, your healed vision, your ability to ask not only, do they finally understand, but also, are they truly ready to show up differently? That is a powerful shift, because now the story is no longer about whether they feel something. The story becomes whether what they feel has been transformed into character, consistency, and courage. If not, then the feeling remains just a lesson. And lessons, no matter how deep, are not always meant to become lifelong homes. Sometimes the hardest part for them is recognizing how visible their inner conflict became over time, even if they never said your name, even if they never admitted what was happening. Even if they tried to act settled and certain, inside there was often a quiet contrast between what they showed and what they truly felt. Outwardly, they may have seemed committed elsewhere, focused elsewhere, invested elsewhere. Inwardly, part of them was still measuring emotional depth against what they once felt with you. Not on purpose all the time, not in a constant dramatic way, but enough to keep the truth alive, enough to make them notice when conversations lacked soul. Enough to make certain moments feel strangely empty, enough to make your memory rise in places they did not expect. This is what unresolved emotional truth does. It moves under the surface. It does not always destroy the image of a life immediately, but it slowly exposes where the life is not fully aligned. It asks uncomfortable questions. Why does this still matter? Why does that memory still feel alive? Why does something that ended still feel unfinished? And if those questions are faced honestly, they lead back to one answer. Because what was between you was real, and reality leaves a mark, not always a visible one, not always a convenient one, but a lasting one. If this is waking up something old inside you, take a breath and keep going, because the final truth is not about them returning. It is about you standing taller in what you now know. So where does all of this lead? To truth, to choice, to a cleaner understanding of what was really happening beneath the silence. They were not able to fully leave you emotionally because the connection asked for something deeper than they could give at that time, and instead of rising to meet it, they chose distance, control, and what felt easier to manage. But easier did not free them. It only delayed the lesson. Now they see more, they feel more, they understand more. They know that you were not an option to be lightly set aside. You were a meaningful connection they were not prepared to handle with the courage it deserved. And now your role is not to carry their guilt, rescue their growth, or reopen your heart just because they finally reached the truth. Your role is to remain grounded, to let your decisions come from clarity, not old pain, to honor what you felt without abandoning what you learned. To remember that real love, if it is ever to meet you again in any form, must arrive with honesty, presence, and steady effort, not with confusion dressed as emotion. Let this settle deeply. What is real will meet you clearly. What cannot meet you clearly will fade on its own. You do not need to chase clarity anymore. You are the clarity now. And if this message touched something true in you, hold on to the part that matters most. You were never too much. You were simply real. And real is exactly what they were not ready for until it was too late to ignore.